You're not empty. You've lost connection with yourself. Everything is fine, so why doesn't it feel like it? You wake up. The alarm goes off at the same time it always does. You get up, make coffee, check your phone, the routine works. Everything is where it's supposed to be. And somewhere between the first sip of coffee and the moment you sit down to start your day, there it is again. That feeling. Not sadness. Not anxiety. Something quieter than that. Something you can't name and can't explain to anyone without sounding ungrateful. You have a life. A real one. People who depend on you, people who love you. A structure you built with your own hands over years of work and sacrifice. And none of that is the problem. That's what makes this so difficult to talk about, because from the outside there's nothing wrong. But you know something is off. Not with your job, not with your relationships, not with any single thing you could point to and say, that's it. That's the problem. It's more like a background frequency. A low, persistent hum that doesn't interrupt your life but never fully disappears either. You can go days without noticing it. And then in the middle of a completely ordinary moment, driving home, sitting in a meeting, lying in bed at night, it's there again. That feeling that you're somehow absent from your own life. Most men do one of two things with that feeling. They push through it. Because that's what you do, you keep going. You're not someone who stops to analyze his feelings in the middle of a Wednesday. Or they assume something must be wrong with them. That maybe they're depressed, that maybe they're just not built for contentment. That maybe gratitude is a skill they never fully developed. Neither one is right. And here's the thing nobody tells you. The guilt that comes after the emptiness is almost worse than the emptiness itself. Because now you're not just carrying the weight of feeling hollow. You're carrying the shame of feeling hollow, when by every reasonable measure you shouldn't be. Why do I feel this way when I have everything? That question doesn't bring clarity. It brings more weight, more noise, more distance between you and whatever it is that's actually happening underneath. Marcus Aurelius spent years writing to himself in private, not for publication, not for legacy, but because he recognized something in his own experience that he couldn't afford to ignore. In what we now call the Meditations, he returned again and again to one uncomfortable truth, that a man can build an entire life, power, order, discipline, structure, and still be a stranger to himself. Not because he failed, but because he stopped paying attention to the one thing that makes him him. This isn't a philosophical problem from 2,000 years ago. It's something that's happening right now, today. This video is not about gratitude. It's not about mindfulness, productivity, or morning routines. It's about something older and more specific than any of that. The slow, quiet process by which a man loses contact with himself and what it actually takes to find the way back. It's not about returning to an idealized version of yourself or about going back to being who you were at 22. It's about returning to something simpler. It's about returning to the feeling of being present in your own life and not just functioning within it. Before we talk about what's missing, we need to understand what actually disappeared and when. You didn't lose yourself all at once. There wasn't a specific moment, no collapse, no single day you could point to and say, that's when it happened. That's what makes this particular kind of loss so difficult to recognize. We're conditioned to look for events, turning points, a before and an after. But the disconnection you're carrying didn't arrive as a rupture. It arrived like weather, gradual, cumulative, and so constant that at some point it simply became the climate of your life. Think about how this actually happens. Not in theory, in real life. You accept a job that isn't exactly what you wanted, but it makes financial sense. You adapt and move forward. You spend less time doing the things that used to make you feel alive. Not because you consciously decided to stop, but because there was always something more urgent. There is always something more urgent. You become better at handling the external world. You attend meetings, meet deadlines, and take on increasing responsibilities. Every day you become more efficient, or at least you try to. You feel more dependable. In many ways, you truly are more capable than you used to be. Your life is progressing, but quietly, without anyone noticing, including you, your inner life begins to receive less attention. It isn't abandoned, it's simply deprioritized. Week after week, month after month, and then one day you realize you can't remember the last time you genuinely felt like yourself. There is an analogy that captures this with uncomfortable precision. Imagine a musical instrument, a guitar, a piano, that never breaks dramatically, never falls, and never suffers obvious damage. It simply drifts out of tune slowly and imperceptibly, one string at a time, a fraction of a note at a time. No one notices because the change is so gradual. The musician keeps playing, the audience keeps listening, and the instrument's dissonance becomes so normalized that when someone finally sits down and plays it properly tuned, it sounds wrong. It sounds strange, because the incorrect version has become familiar. That is what happens to a person who spends years prioritizing adaptation over authenticity. The version of yourself that once felt natural, spontaneous, genuine, authentic, didn't disappear dramatically. It was slowly replaced by a version that functions better in external environments. A version that is more agreeable, more productive, more consistent with what the people around you need you to be. And because that version works, because it pays the bills, maintains relationships, and shows up when it's supposed to, no one questions it. Not even you. You simply keep going. The problem isn't that you changed. Change is inevitable. The problem is that somewhere in the process of changing, you stopped connecting with what was genuinely true for you, and began measuring everything by what was functional for everyone else. You became good at living a life. You simply stopped feeling like you were actually living it. When was the last time you laughed out loud when no one was around? The last time you took a deep breath and felt completely at peace? Here's what nobody tells you. The version of yourself that you lost never disappeared. It simply went quiet. And there is a reason for that silence. The life you built might be the cage. Ask most men when they lost themselves and they'll point to a crisis, a divorce, a failure, a period of darkness they had to climb out of. That's the story we tell. That hardship is what pulls a man away from himself. But that's not usually how it happens, and the Stoics of all people understood this better than most. The real danger isn't failure. It's success that arrives before you know who you are, because when things fall apart, you're forced to reckon with yourself. Crisis strips away the unnecessary. It's brutal, but it's honest. It removes the scaffolding and leaves you standing in front of whatever is actually there. Most men who go through real hardship come out of it knowing themselves more clearly, even if everything else is worse. Success does the opposite. Success adds. It builds layers, it gives you more to maintain, more to protect, more to become identified with. And with every layer added, the distance between the surface and the center quietly increases. The house, the title, the role you play in your family, the reputation you've built professionally. These aren't problems in themselves. They're the natural result of effort and responsibility. But at some point, without a deliberate act of separation, they stop being things you have and become things you are. And when your identity becomes indistinguishable from your structure, when you can't tell where the role ends and the person begins, you've handed over something you may not even realize you've lost. Most men don't lose themselves in their worst moments. They lose themselves during their most successful ones, slowly while building exactly the life they thought they wanted. Read that again, because it runs directly against everything you were taught. You were told that success would bring clarity, that once you had the structure in place, you'd have space to breathe, to think, to be. Nobody warned you that the structure itself could become the noise, that the very life you built to feel secure could be the thing making you feel absent. The cage wasn't built from failure. It was built from achievement, one reasonable, responsible decision at a time. And this isn't about tearing it all down. It's not a call to abandon what you've built or romanticize a simpler life you never actually had. It's something more precise than that. It's the recognition that what you've constructed externally needs to be matched, consciously, deliberately, by something internal. Otherwise, the architecture of your life becomes a performance you're trapped inside. And the Stoics saw this coming, not as a modern problem, but as the oldest trap a man can fall into. Marcus Aurelius called it by a different name. Marcus Aurelius was one of the most powerful men who ever lived. He commanded legions, governed an empire, managed crises that would have broken most people completely. And in private, in the notebooks he never intended anyone to read, he kept returning to the same quiet obsession: not strategy, not power, not legacy. Stay connected to yourself, don't drift. Don't let the role consume the man. The meditations aren't a philosophical treatise. They're a private conversation, a man talking to himself repeatedly about the same danger. The danger of becoming so absorbed in external function that the inner life quietly disappears. He wrote, "Look within. Within is the fountain of good, and it will ever bubble up if thou wilt ever dig," not as inspiration, as a warning. Because he knew from direct experience how easy it is to stop digging. Epictetus approached the same problem from a different angle. Born a slave, stripped of every external freedom, he had no choice but to understand the distinction between what belongs to you and what doesn't. And what he identified, the thing he called the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty of the mind, was the center of a man's identity that external circumstances cannot touch, unless the man himself abandons it. This is the distinction the Stoics kept returning to, the difference between the persona, the mask, the role, the social function, and the hegemonikon, the actual center of who you are. The directing intelligence, the part of you that watches, chooses, reflects, and decides, both are real, both are necessary. The persona gets you through the world. It manages relationships, maintains status, fulfills obligations. There's nothing wrong with having one. The problem is when the persona becomes so dominant, so well constructed, so consistently rewarded, that the man beneath it stops being consulted. When you start living entirely from the outside in, when every decision runs through the filter of what's expected, before it ever reaches the filter of what's true. The Stoics didn't call this emptiness. They didn't call it depression or disconnection. They called it living against your nature. Kataphusin, according to nature, was the Stoic ideal. And nature in this context didn't mean forests and rivers. It meant your nature. The specific, irreducible character of who you are when nothing external is demanding anything from you. To lose contact with that is, in Stoic terms, not just a personal loss, it's a philosophical failure. A failure to exercise the one freedom no external circumstance can remove. But understanding this philosophically is one thing. Feeling it in your body is another. And that's where something unexpected enters the conversation. Your body knew before your mind did. There's a moment most men have had, and almost none talk about. You're in the middle of a completely ordinary day. Nothing dramatic is happening. You're functional, you're present, you're doing what needs to be done. And then, for no reason you can identify, you stop. You look out a window, or you step outside for a minute, or you find yourself standing in a room and realizing you have no memory of walking into it. And there's this feeling, not pain, not sadness exactly, something closer to a pull. Like something in you is trying to get your attention and doesn't have the words for it. You shake it off, you go back to what you were doing. But that moment, that small wordless interruption, wasn't random. That was your system doing something very specific. That was the part of you that doesn't speak in language, trying to communicate in the only way it knows how. The body keeps a record that the mind edits. You can rationalize the disconnection. You can explain it away, contextualize it, build a coherent narrative about why you feel the way you feel and why it makes sense given everything you're managing. The mind is extraordinarily good at that. It will construct a story that makes the drift seem reasonable, even inevitable. But the body doesn't rationalize, it registers. It holds in physical form every moment of suppressed tension, every silenced need, every authentic impulse that got redirected towards something more functional. The tightness in the chest that appears in certain conversations, the exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix, the specific restlessness that comes not from doing too much, but from doing too much of the wrong things for too long. Bessel van der Kolk spent decades studying what happens to human beings when their inner experience is systematically disconnected from their outer life. What he found wasn't abstract, it was physical. The nervous system, designed for genuine response, for actual presence, actual feeling, actual engagement, begins to dysregulate when it's required to perform rather than respond. When the gap between what's felt and what's expressed becomes wide enough, the body starts sending signals, not subtle ones. This isn't trauma in the clinical sense, but the mechanism is similar. When authentic experience is consistently overridden, when who you actually are is consistently subordinated to who the situation needs you to be, the system starts looking for equilibrium through other channels. The pull toward nature isn't romanticism. The need for silence isn't weakness. The inexplicable desire to be somewhere slower, somewhere quieter, somewhere that asks nothing of you, that's not escapism. That's your nervous system trying to regulate itself back toward something real after years of operating in performance mode. Your body already knows the way back. So if your body already knows, why is it so hard to follow? Because something is actively keeping you away from yourself. And it has a name. The noise was never the problem. You were feeding it. Here's the part that's hardest to sit with. The disconnection you're carrying isn't being done to you. Not entirely. The world is loud, yes. The demands are real, yes. The pace is genuinely relentless. But if you look closely, honestly, you'll find something uncomfortable underneath all of that. You've been feeding the noise, not because you're weak, because the noise serves a function. Silence is dangerous for a man who has unresolved questions about himself. Not dangerous in the dramatic sense. No one is afraid of a quiet room. Dangerous in the specific sense that silence removes the interference. And when the interference is gone, what's left is the conversation you've been avoiding. The one about whether the life you're living is actually yours. Whether the choices that made sense at 28 still reflect who you are at 38. Whether the version of yourself you've been performing for the last decade is the real one, or just the most functional one. That conversation is uncomfortable, so the noise becomes useful. Not consciously. Nobody decides I'm going to stay busy to avoid my inner life. It's subtler than that. It's the phone that gets checked in every moment of stillness, the podcast that plays during every commute, the work that extends just past the point where it needs to, the drink at the end of the day that takes the edge off, not of stress but of the quiet that would follow if the stress were actually processed. The man who says he wants peace but reaches for his phone the moment a room goes quiet. The man who says he wants to know himself but fills every available gap with input, stimulation, obligation. The man who has structured his entire life around not having to stop. That man isn't broken. He's afraid of what stopping might show him. And that fear, that specific, intelligent, completely understandable fear, is what's keeping the distance intact. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." It sounds like comfort, but read it again in context, and it's actually a challenge, because he wasn't describing a place most men naturally go. He was describing a place that requires deliberate entry. They're a place most men actively avoid, not because they don't believe in it, but because arriving there means arriving alone, without distraction, with nothing between them and whatever is actually true. The noise was never the enemy. You were using it as insulation, and the moment you understand that, really understand it, not just intellectually but in the specific texture of your own daily behavior, everything changes. Because now the question isn't how do I find more silence? The question is what am I not willing to look at? And this is where Stoicism stops being philosophy and becomes something you can actually use. not as wisdom, as a practice. The return doesn't start with a decision. It starts with a pause. Most men, when they finally recognize the disconnection, make the same mistake. They treat it like a problem to be solved. They look for the system, the habit stack, the morning routine that will close the gap. They bring the same energy to reconnection that they brought to everything else that worked in their lives. Intensity, structure, execution. And it doesn't work. Not because those things are bad, but because this particular problem wasn't built by insufficient effort. It was built by effort directed entirely outward, for too long without interruption. You don't reconnect with yourself by adding more to your life. You reconnect by creating the conditions where the parts of you that went quiet can start speaking again. And that begins with something almost insultingly simple: a pause. Not meditation, if that word carries resistance for you. Not journaling, if you're not someone who journals. Not a retreat or a radical life change or a conversation with a therapist, though none of those things are wrong. Something smaller than all of that. A moment, a single deliberate moment in the middle of an ordinary day, where you stop performing and just notice. Notice what's actually there. Not what should be there. Not what you'd prefer to be feeling. What's actually present in your body, in your chest, in the back of your mind right now. The Stoics called this prosos, attention to self. Not in the modern sense of self-care or self-optimization. In the philosophical sense of bearing witness to your own inner life, with honesty and without judgment. Marcus Aurelius practiced it daily. Epictetus taught it as the foundation of everything else. Not because it feels good, but because without it, every other form of discipline is being applied to a self you don't actually know. Here's what it looks like in practice. You catch yourself reaching for the phone in a moment of stillness. You stop, not to be virtuous, just to notice, what was I about to avoid? You sit in that question for 30 seconds. That's it. That's the beginning. You finish a conversation and realize you performed your way through it, said what was expected, managed the dynamic, navigated it successfully. You stop, you ask, what did I actually feel in there? Not to change anything, just to register it. You're driving home and you turn the audio off. For 5 minutes. Not to think, not to solve, just to let whatever is actually present in you surface without interference. These aren't grand gestures. They're interruptions in the pattern of avoidance. Small, consistent acts of presence in a life that has been running primarily on performance. Each one creates a slightly shorter distance between who you are on the surface and who you actually are underneath. The goal isn't to find some hidden, truer self that's been buried under your responsibilities. The self isn't hidden. It's been waiting. In the spaces you keep filling, in the silences you keep breaking, in the pauses you've been skipping for years. You don't need to go looking for yourself. You need to stop running from yourself long enough for the distance to close. And if you made it to the end of this video, if something in here landed with the kind of weight that means it touched something real, then you already know what the first pause needs to feel like. You've been feeling it this whole time. And if you've ever watched a video all the way to the end and thought, this one was different, leave that in the comments. I read every single one, and I'll be here with the next conversation whenever you're ready for it.